Good afternoon. Welcome to the Center for Comparative Immigration Studies and to this inaugural seminar of the 2003-04 academic year. Today's seminar is co-sponsored by the Center for U.S.-Mexican Studies at UCSD. Our topic is anti-immigrant vigilante activity in the U.S.-Mexico borderlands. There has been an upsurge in vigilante activity in recent years as unauthorized border crossings have shifted from San Diego County to central Arizona in response to changes in U.S. border enforcement strategy. These groups identify themselves in various ways, often as civilian militias, even as Homeland Defense Forces. They have sprung up in response to what their members call the alien invasion from Mexico. They define their mission as protecting the property rights of ranchers and other property owners on the U.S. side of the border and holding the line against illegal aliens whose numbers overwhelm the resources of the official Border Patrol. Anti-immigrant vigilantes are now operating in all of the southwestern border states. One of these groups, which calls itself Ranch Rescue, claims to have chapters throughout the border region. But the epicenter of the 21st century anti-immigrant vigilante movement is clearly in Arizona. It is estimated that more than 40% of all illegal entries along the southwestern border now occur through the central Arizona desert. Vigilantes are on patrol every day, every night in that region. They are led by people like Chris Simcox, a former Los Angeles school teacher now based in Tombstone, Arizona, and Glenn Spencer, another longtime anti-immigration activist who moved east from Los Angeles. Some vigilante groups are low-tech and unarmed, but others are heavily armed, and they've been investing in increasingly sophisticated surveillance technology. The group calling itself American Border Patrol monitors movements of illegal migrants through the global positioning system. They, in fact, beat the U.S. government in deploying this technology by at least 6 months. The Department of Homeland Security doesn't expect to be patrolling the southwest border with unmanned aerial vehicles like this until the end of this year. The highly public activities of anti-immigrant vigilante groups in obvious violation of federal law raise serious questions about how federal, state, and local authorities, including the U.S. Border Patrol, are responding to vigilantism. We have assembled a panel of experts to analyze this phenomenon for you and to put it in historical context. In the interest of time, I'm going to introduce all of them at this point. Kelly Lytle is a specialist on the history of the U.S.-Mexico borderlands. She is currently finishing a book on the history of the U.S. Border Patrol as a University of California President's Fellow based in the UCSD Department of Ethnic Studies, and she is headed to a faculty position at UCLA. Robert Castro is a political scientist who teaches in the Department of Chicano Studies at California State University in Fullerton. He also holds a law degree from UCLA. He has written on the prospects for curbing anti-immigrant vigilantism through public interest litigation. Isabel Garcia is also trained as a lawyer. She is co-chair of the Human Rights Coalition, an important immigrants' rights organization based in Tucson, Arizona, where she is also director of the Pima County Legal Defender's Office. And finally, the Reverend Robin Hoover also comes to us from Tucson, Arizona. He is the founding president of an organization called Humane Borders, which provides water and other forms of humanitarian assistance to undocumented migrants attempting to cross the Arizona desert. He also holds a PhD in political science. Many thanks to all of you for being here today. I've asked all of our panelists to provide some brief opening remarks, and when all of them have spoken, we'll be happy to take your questions. Also, in the interest of time, I will ask that you hold your applause until all of the panelists have spoken. Kelly Lytle, please get us started.
Good afternoon. Well, I'm a historian, so when Wayne asked me to come here and do this today, I thought about, what can I contribute to this conversation? And what I want to do is put this eruption of border vigilantes in a broad historical perspective. I'm not going to talk specifically about each individual vigilante, but more about what has sparked this movement at this time in U.S. history. So, beginning with the South Carolina Regulator movement of the 1767 to 1769, there have been at least 500 vigilante movements in U.S. history. Now, like all other vigilante movements, including what's going on in Arizona today, the South Carolina Regulators were organized in response to a sense among elite people, elite members of the community, that there was a lack of adequate law enforcement. Now, this is really important to remember about vigilantes. There's not what we usually think about vigilantes being the poor white trash of the community. These are elite members. Now, like the American Border Patrol, the Ranch Rescue, and the Civilian Homeland Defense, the South Carolina Regulators believed that social order was under attack by crime and chaos. The regulators, therefore, took the law into their own hands to control a very specific criminal threat and disbanded when that threat was extinguished. Now, this is a pattern that's been played and replayed throughout history, and the border vigilantes are just the newest incarnation of an old theme. It's absolutely correct that Operation Gatekeeper and Operation Hold the Line were the immediate sparks to this new wave of vigilantism. But to understand border vigilantes, we must analyze the construction of the criminal alien, the construction of the criminal threat that has awoken them from their slumber. So along the U.S.-Mexico border, the criminalization not only of migration, but of migrants, individual migrants, has sparked this new chapter in vigilantism. Therefore, what I want to discuss today is the rise of what we call the criminal alien in discourse and in structure to locate the emergence of border vigilantes in the late 20th century. Now, despite all the literature of criminology about whether nature or nurture makes crime, it's the state that makes crime. So before bad parenting, rap music, or rock and roll, it's the state that makes criminals by making crime. Now, the U.S. Congress devised the crime of illegal immigration in 1808, when it first passed the ban on the African slave trade, but made few provisions for detecting and deporting unsanctioned immigrants until the formation of the U.S. Border Patrol in 1924. And then in 1929, Congress made the crime of unsanctioned entry a felony for second-time offenders. So in 1929, we have the first time when you can go to jail for this crime. Yet, while illegal immigration may have been a punishable crime in the 1920s and 1930s, agribusiness leaders in the Southwest did not regard undocumented immigrants as criminal threats. Many regarded Mexico as an ideal source of cheap labor, particularly because they regarded Mexicans as docile and temporary. This is very important, docile and temporary. Quote, if we could not keep the Mexicans in control and they would take this country, it would be better to keep them out. But we do and can control them. This is what advised one grower when he spoke against restricting Mexican immigration. So one of the best control mechanisms growers believed they had was that Mexican immigrants did not remain within the United States. It was a seasonal migration that began and ended in Mexico, but left its sweat, labor, and large profit margins in the United States. So, as S. Parker Frizzell argued in the 1920s, quote, the Mexican is a homer, like a pigeon, he goes home to roost. Now, this is what made Mexican immigration in the 1920s and 1930s okay and acceptable. So far from a threat, the dominant discourse that depicted legal and illegal Mexican immigrants as obedient, docile, manageable, and temporary. Now, throughout the 1920s and 1930s, immigration law enforcement work was embedded within the regional demands of agribusiness. Border Patrol officers suspended aggressive immigration law enforcement for a basic minimum of just guaranteeing that Mexican immigrants remain temporary. But World War II shifted the geopolitics of immigration law enforcement along the U.S.-Mexico border. So it was no longer local beginning in World War II, it became national and transnational. The threat of saboteurs illegally entering the United States, embedded with Mexican migration flows, caused many national leaders to pay attention to our land borders for the first time. When the war began, the crime of illegal immigration was pregnant with new fears of invasion and sabotage. Therefore, in 1941, Congress granted the United States Border Patrol a large appropriation for additional officers and new equipment to improve their control and vigilance of land and water borders. Now, in addition to these national concerns, Mexico embarked upon an intensive industrialization program in the 1940s and called its laborers home to help Mexico grow. So when Mexican laborers refused and they remained within the United States, the Mexican government demanded that the U.S. Border Patrol increase vigilance of the southern border. So you have demands coming from Mexico to increase vigilance of the U.S.-Mexico border. And it was in direct response to Mexican demands that the U.S. Border Patrol placed the large majority of officers hired in the 1940s and 1950s on the U.S.-Mexico border. Before World War II, the vast majority of Border Patrol officers had been on the Canadian border. After World War II, they're on the southern border. So what we begin to see here is a focus on the Mexican border coming from demands out of Mexico. This is something we don't tend to think about. Now, looking deep into Border Patrol correspondence with the Department of State, it reveals that the initial swelling of U.S. Border Patrol personnel along the U.S.-Mexico border and the shift in national focus from the Canadian to the Mexican border occurred in response to Mexican demands. Now, regardless of this new attention being paid to controlling undocumented immigration by U.S. and Mexican officials, illegal crossings skyrocketed throughout the 1940s and 1950s. To counter the rise in undocumented immigration, Mexico collaborated with the United States Border Patrol to deport Mexican nationals living illegally within the United States. So in the summer of 1954, U.S. Border Patrol and Mexican Border Patrol officers waged their largest campaign against undocumented Mexican immigration called Operation Wetback, in which they deported over 1 million Mexican nationals. Now, immediately after the close of Operation Wetback, the U.S. Border Patrol instructed officers that, quote, "In our contacts with each other, the public and the press, whenever a criminal record exists, we use the words, quote, criminal alien, and when no criminal record exists, the words deportable alien. I feel this change will have a psychological effect on the public and the courts that will benefit the service." Soon after, in the early 1960s, they decided that the term deportable alien was not deemed strong enough and substituted the term with border violator. As the Border Patrol argued, although the wetback was someone who was, quote, an illiterate farm laborer who came from Mexico to work in the fields, they explained that the day of the wetback was over and the day of the border violator, the fugitive in a foreign country, they explained, had arrived. So here we see the beginnings of a rhetoric within the U.S.-Mexico borderlands that criminalized undocumented Mexican immigrants. The temporary docile laborer was becoming a border violator, a criminal, and a fugitive. Still, nothing did more to criminalize undocumented Mexican immigration than the war on drugs. Initiated with President Nixon and escalated with Reagan and onwards, the war on drugs has been pitched as a battle against a national crisis. Urban centers and the U.S.-Mexican border have both been foci of the campaign to get drugs off the streets. The subsequent militarization of the U.S.-Mexico border and the war on drugs has militarized the physical and political spaces of undocumented immigration. The mounting law and order discourse of border violators and criminal aliens occurring when the Border Patrol collided with this war on drugs militarization of the U.S.-Mexico border and linked the border's flight paths from poverty with the battle zones of drug trafficking. So for migrants who were unable to afford to cross the increasingly monitored border, some agreed to carry packages for drug traffickers to fund their journey north. The entanglements of labor migration and drug smuggling have resulted in rapidly rising incarceration rates for undocumented immigrants, particularly Mexicans, within the United States. Between 1985 and 2000, the percentage of non-citizens in federal prison increased from 15% to 29%, making immigrants the fastest growing sector of the federal prison population. And as the year 2000, 54% of non-citizen inmates have been convicted of a drug charge. Non-citizens are being convicted of drug charges, not immigration charges. 35% of an immigration offense and 11% of other offenses. Now, as drug laws are lifting young men and young women, particularly black men and women, out of our communities, they are also trapping Mexicanos, immigrant and citizen. At the same time, the incarceration rate of those convicted of immigration offenses increased from 57% to 97% between 1985 and 2000, and the average time spent in jail increased from 3.6 months to 20.6 months. So together, drug and immigration laws are injecting the streams of immigration from Mexico with new levels of structural criminalization. This isn't just an idea of the criminal alien, this is the structural criminalization of migrants. This rapid growth in the number of non-citizens in U.S. jails, prisons, and detention centers for immigration and drug offenses has contributed to the health of the prison economy in the United States. For example, in 1995, when Wicomico County, Maryland needed to raise $65,000 in 3 days, the county jail warden, quote, picked up the phone and called the INS and said, "Send me 70 inmates," and it was done. So when jails run short on inmates, wardens can often depend upon the INS to fill empty beds, ensuring the fiscal solvency of the growing prison system. As of the year 2000, the INS spent just over 1/3 of its $800 million detention budget renting beds from 225 jails throughout the United States. The rising number of immigrant inmates is less evidence of increased immigrant criminality and more a reflection of shifts in immigration and drug laws, intensified policing efforts along the border and in migrant communities. Still, this new structural basis for the discourse of the criminal alien contributes to a mounting panic about Mexican immigration to the United States. Census reports are making it clear that Mexican immigrants are no longer temporary. Numerically speaking, Hispanics are now the largest minority within the United States. Now, some extremists, like the Vigilantes, paint Mexican immigration as, quote, a brown invasion, or as they like to say, reconquista. And they interpret each undocumented entry as a threat to national security. For others, there is just a quiet anxiety about how Latino immigration is transforming the traditional racial composition and social order of the United States. Therefore, what I want to end with today is the way that the war on drugs has transformed border spaces and filled prisons has fueled a general panic about race and migration in the United States. And as the collision of discourses of the criminal alien with incarceration structures of the war on drugs during a specific period of a racial panic that has awoken this vigilante spirit along the U.S.-Mexico border at the turn of the 21st century. Thank you.
I think what Kelly has provided, of course, is really the fundamental reasons why we see the vigilantes today. They're not a new phenomenon, and of course, we are now seeing major attention given to vigilantes by a lot of the media. Back in 1976, when I began to do immigration work, we had our first vigilante that we thought in our recent history. Not the first vigilantes, of course, many in the 20s and the 30s. But a rancher by the name of Hannigan and his 2 sons decided to capture 3 immigrants that were coming through their ranch, captured them and tortured them, burned them with cigarettes, shot pellets in their backs. And eventually they escaped, went into Mexico, where they went to the Mexican consulate and eventually came to our attention. U.S. authorities at that time refused to press any charges, indicating that the witnesses were gone. With the help of the Mexican consulate, we were able to obtain the victims and witnesses to these atrocious acts, and we brought forth these charges. We persuaded the Cochise County authorities to actually press charges of aggravated assault. We, of course, monitored that situation. Cochise County is a good 80% Hispanic. However, that jury that heard this case was 100% white and Anglo. In the audience were the ranchers that lived in the area, all of them with their eyes on that jury and present at every moment. We were basically monitoring that situation as well. They were, not surprisingly, found not guilty. It was then that we then mobilized for a federal criminal civil rights type of violation. After a lot of movement by the community, in fact, they were charged in federal court. The father died of a heart attack in the interim because it took a couple of years, and one of the brothers was found guilty and one of them was found not guilty. Back and then in 1985, another gentleman by the name of Bo Burris decided to capture a Mexicano who was crossing through his ranch. And because he had had some items stolen, tools stolen from his ranch, he decided to capture a Mexicano and chained him to the toilet. Again, this gentleman escaped. The authorities said we don't have a victim, and again, we had to rely on the Mexican consulate to help us to locate, and eventually he was allowed to plead guilty to a very minor offense. What was very alarming was in 1987, the civilian military assistants, who had changed his name to the civilian material assistants. If some of you recall, they were the ones that were doing gun running in Nicaragua, guns for drugs. And that particular organization had decided to begin operations in the Arizona border to train their members. And so they disabled a couple of vehicles containing men, women, and children, held them for 12 hours. Again, these individuals were not going to be prosecuted, but for our and the community's intervention again. The government at this particular stage didn't know what to charge them with and was very reluctant. And of course, we later found out from Tom Posey, who was the head of the CMA, that in fact the Border Patrol had provided them grids and maps of the area. And now we understand why the U.S. government was reluctant to prosecute them. Through our own investigation, that is the community and our nonprofit organizations, we found out through, I guess, a disgruntled ex-wife, that in fact this man was an immigrant from California who had changed his name. He proclaimed to the Arizona public that he needed to stop the drug runners that were damaging our community and poisoning our children. Through the wife, we determined and found out that he in fact had been convicted in California of a drug smuggling conviction and had changed his name. Of course, we provided this information to the federal government. The federal government immediately charged him with being a felon in possession of a firearm, stopped all investigations, permitted him to plead guilty to that, and gave him a slap on the wrist and shooed him out of Arizona so that we could not pursue those connections that he had with the federal agents in the Border Patrol. This was alarming to us because, of course, it wasn't one individual like the Hannigan or Bo Burris. It was an organized group. And, of course, we were very disturbed. Of course, then in March of 1999, we then see what we believe is a conspiracy to violate the laws. In March of 1999, 20 or so ranchers signed a proclamation to the federal authorities and the state authorities, telling them that they, in fact, were going to take the law into their own hands, that the border was out of control, that they expected that blood would be shed. All of this is in a written letter, of course, to the federal government. Of course, this coincides with Operation Gatekeeper being implemented in San Diego, Operation Hold the Line in El Paso, the two major points of entry for immigrants, and then the closing off of the port of entry in Nogales, and so everybody was streaming through Cochise County. It's not coincidental, I believe, that these ranchers went public about 2 weeks after Doris Meisner stood in the well of the Congress, asking the Congress not to make her hire 1,000 agents per year. If you recall, they were under that mandate. And Doris Meisner documented and explained to the Congress that, in fact, it was a mistake to force her to hire 1,000 new agents per year. There was problems with recruitment, problems with screening, problems with training and supervision. 2 weeks after that, we have these ranchers in this proclamation with the media surrounding them. Congressman Colby then coming forward and having a massive press conference as well, stating we need more Border Patrol agents here. So we began this organized vigilante activity, which we had not seen in our particular experience, but for the CMA, which was sort of a different situation. These were local ranchers that were coming in, not an outside group training at the border. These were local ranchers that were telling the federal government, we in fact are going to violate the law. That began, of course, in a whole series of incidents and situations along the borders. Assaults, detentions with deadly weapons, assault dogs, stopping of people on the public highways, not their own private property, beating up of people. Roger Barnett boasted in the one of the national magazines that in fact he had to beat several people up because they did not obey him as most of them did. Obviously, most of the people were in fact very docile because they, between he and his brother, would gather 50 to 100 immigrants at once, just the two men, with 100 or so immigrants. That proves, of course, that they are peaceful people. A couple of people refused to obey them, and those were the people that were beat up. Then the Cccc Group was formed. It was the Concerned Citizens of Cochise County was formed. They linked up with hate groups that we all know, the KKK, Voices of Citizens Together out of California, David Duke's No Fear, and they held a very racist public rally in Sierra Vista, which is in southern Arizona. They, of course, invited all of these organizations to come in to, again, protect their personal property and protect the United States. They issued brochures asking people to come and have fun in the sun, urging all of them to bring all of their military-type equipment, trip wires, night goggles, heat-sensing equipment, and, of course, everything but the guns. I mean, they didn't state outright that they should bring the guns, but all of these people were armed. So they had held this hate rally. Featured in this hate rally, and we have videos of it, is the sheriff of Cochise County, Larry Deaver. He was one of their featured speakers. They applauded him. He applauded them. He even acknowledged that he was sort of part of a group. He stated something to the effect that there were outside groups coming in with different agendas. He said not necessarily bad agendas, and he was referring to KKK, David Duke's No Fear. He said, but not our agendas. Over and over, instances were brought to his attention for prosecution. He refused to prosecute on every single one of these occasions. In addition, in June of 2000, we held a vigil, Derechos Humanos, our human rights organization. We held a vigil to draw attention, of course, to the deaths at the border. Although we as Derechos Humanos began mobilizing and asking the federal officials and state officials to act against the vigilantes, we have continued to focus on what we believe is the major culprit here, and that is border policy. The media has given 1,000 times more attention to the vigilante groups, even though they are few. They are dangerous, but they are few. And they've not given this attention to the border deaths. And so we held a vigil in June of 2000 to call attention to the situation. I received a call from the Department of Justice, the Community Relations, telling me that I should not attend the vigil because the American Patrol .com, the American Border Patrol website, had description about me, beginning to use very irresponsible language about who I was, and called me the Reconquista Queen, Aslan cheerleader, traitor, agent of Mexico, and they actually drew a little X where they thought that I would be standing. And so Department of Justice and the local police asked me not to attend. I did attend. I didn't speak. I had a braid on the side. They didn't recognize me. The following day in their little chat groups, they indicated that they were able to scare me off and I wasn't there. They continued on their assaults, and Senator Kyle and Congressman Colby called for more militarization rather than calling for restraint and calling for governmental officials to take action. In May of 2000, the 4 county sheriffs got together and indicated that they supported the actions of the vigilantes and that, in fact, the communications between them should improve. In October of 2000, the Department of Justice again issued a officer safety bulletin indicating these people were dangerous. And then the American Border Patrol began an all-out assault against me. They not only caused many threats to be sent my way, but they also wrote to the county administrator and the county board of supervisors, who I work for, demanding that I be fired. Again, using very irresponsible language. Irresponsible in the sense that people that aren't mentally stable could easily take this language and use it to do harm to myself or my family because I was called a traitor to the United States and a threat to our country. So they began these operations. They have literally had military operations where they cross personnel, guns, ammunition, all the firepower you can imagine, and they give themselves military-type names such as Operation Raven, Operation Falcon, Operation Hawkeye. They've even intercepted, they claim, drugs. They claim because then they staged it, they claimed they found drugs, they moved it onto a certain property, and then called the officials in. Right in the fall of 2001, after this Operation Hawk, 3 individuals, 3 Mexicanos were killed in Red Rock, right east of Tucson, Arizona. The witnesses indicate that, in fact, the shooters were dressed in military fatigues. That has never been resolved. Most of the local authorities claim that it was probably smugglers. But that makes no sense, as coyotes will not kill what's going to bring money to them, and we had never heard of coyotes dressing in military garb. Then another person was shot and killed in 3 points. Again, no resolution to this case. American Border Patrol then sets up in Sierra Vista. Of course, we understand that he used to live in California, and you either ran him out or he became irrelevant, and he tells the Arizona public, of course, that he came because the state of Arizona has been lost. But in any event, he has set up an operation. I want to let you know that about 2 months ago he was arrested outside of his home. He got outside of his home and began shooting at the neighbor's house. He now claims that he's received many threats and that we're going to see what's going on in the courtroom. And we have yet to hear of any justification for the shooting, and that case is pending. On his board of directors is the ex-Border Patrol chief out of Tucson, Ron Saunders, who was a Border Patrol chief for 8 years. On his board is also the ex-Border Patrol chief of Los Angeles, Bill King. That obviously causes us great concern because we know that back when we were doing the investigation of the CMA, we knew there was connection with Border Patrol. And now with 2 Border Patrol chiefs on his board of directors, we are very concerned that information, resources, and personnel are being shared with him. When we asked the Border Patrol chief, David Aguilar, at a civil rights hearing of the U.S. Civil Rights Commission, whether in fact, or what his agency was doing to make sure that in fact Border Patrol personnel was not going to them, he refused to answer and said those are individual organizations. And in December of last year, on International Day of the Migrant, on December 18th, when we held events about the day, Border Patrol was quoted as saying that the Civilian Homeland Defense, the American Border Patrol, and Ranch Rescue were friends of theirs, and in fact had every right to exist just as Derechos Humanos did. Chris Simcox has now been arrested for carrying a gun in a national forest. And another good thing is that in Yuma, just 1 month ago, 3 individuals were arrested for assault on 3 migrants. It's no coincidence that the county attorney is a sympathetic Hispanic woman who saw that it was a violation of the law and charged them as such. We also understand that There is a new organization coming in from Michigan called Special Services that indicate that they're going to set up shop in the Yuma County. I would just like to leave you with the idea that the vigilantes aren't the big issue. The big issue really is border policy. Not only do we have involvement by what we believe officials, federal officials, local officials with these organizations, but more than anything, we believe that vigilantes are acting out border patrol policy. Thank you.
Deaths in the desert are epiphenomenal of the several fatally flawed U.S. border policies. There's no such thing as one border policy. They are the primary concern of our work in humane borders, but similarly, what we're talking about today, calling vigilantism, is a byproduct, if you will, of the embedded social and cultural elements of racism, of bigotry, of resentment, and indifference. Border policies and the diffuse yet distinct cultural elements must be considered in any proper border analysis. Border policies and all four of these cultural elements call for at least minimal theory construction. I'm going to try to do some of that. We clearly observe that vigilantism mirrors U.S. border policies in general. Unfortunately, the legal political model can only partially address the phenomenon. Regrettably, support for the status quo and even more of what we're concerned about today is being supported by both elected officials and very high public administrators. In ways similar to humanitarianism, our tendencies towards vigilantism are sedimented into law, in the police powers of the general public, and the rights of individuals to bear arms, and in the kind of state political initiatives that we're seeing now in Protect Arizona Now initiative. The negative cultural elements that I have mentioned segue quickly into the use of weapons and into the more generalized use of force and violence. One case in point, one Border Patrol agent regularly networks with Chris Simcox, founder of Civilian Homeland Defense, one of the vigilante groups that has been mentioned. As a federal agent, this man already accepts in principle, if not in practice, the use of force against migrants, and he encourages citizens to embrace his vision of a border by standing with those who are being prosecuted for taking the law into their own hands. And that was certainly evident what's going on in Yuma right now, in this last, in the protest that was there on Friday. It'll be evident at the sentencing hearing in Yuma tomorrow. There, 3 men are being prosecuted for detaining migrants at gunpoint, handcuffing them, turning them over to the Border Patrol. Only days later was the office of the sheriff and prosecutor involved. Tomorrow, some of our volunteers will be standing there to support the Yuma County prosecutor. At the state government level, we certainly do know how to prosecute an individual case. I point to the arrest, conviction, and sentencing of a Phoenix man who murdered a Sikh man, whom the murderer mistakenly, right after 9/11, identified as an Arab. That's good government when we can do that kind of work. In the collective sense, the task is far more difficult. It is more insidious, more offensive, more to be abhorred, and more resisted. However, both expressions, unfortunately, have the same moral and cultural roots. So I propose today sort of a preliminary typology of both vigilantism thinking and behavior, and comments on why I think the task before the activist community will be formidable. Look for a moment at the most visible vigilante types in Arizona. We've mentioned them all. Ranch Rescue is led by Jack Foote from Abilene, Texas. Purportedly, this organization is most concerned with private property laws and national sovereignty questions. Private property laws are extremely different in Texas than in Arizona. I cite the case, and humorously, of the rancher who shot down a Border Patrol helicopter in the mid-'80s because it was scattering the cattle while they were looking for the migrants. When brought before a judge, the case was dismissed immediately because the rancher had warned the federal government repeatedly not to violate his airspace. That's hard evidence of property law differences between Texas and Arizona, and most states for that matter. That said, the same questions of property rights and national sovereignty are of concern to many people living in Cochise County, Arizona, which is to the far right of your map over here, hence the semi-warm reception of Ranch Rescue. This paramilitary bunch of weekend warriors is limited to working on private property, and that's in the white area, and some of the white area is also state trust land. Funding for that organization is opportunistic, that is, those playing soldier pay their own way. This organization has a major civil lawsuit pending against it in Texas for rights violations of migrants. However, even if the suit is won, that does not diminish the public sentiment that gives rise to its expression. Others, or the very same people, can simply reorganize if they choose. Civil Homeland Defense is run by Chris Simcox. He and his followers operate on private property and on some of the Arizona State Trust lands to the right of the map. His playground is quite a bit larger. His work is again limited to the lands on which he can legally operate. It is hard to pin down his primary objective since he redefines who he is just about every other month. He recently reached out to us and some other organizations calling himself a humanitarian because he's saving lives by arresting people and beating them up. Tomorrow he will be in Yuma to support those who are unlawfully detaining migrants at gunpoint. Funding for Civil Homeland Defense is a little more diffuse in the general public, but mostly it's from participants. Border Patrol Intelligence, however, reported to me that some of the original funding for CHD came from one of the original founders of the national organization that we all know as the Center for Immigration Studies. Restrictionists stick together. Simcox has this federal charge pending against him. Ranch Rescue would never be able to operate on any of the federal lands in the West Desert. There's no question about that. But a successful prosecution of Simcox is not guaranteed. American Border Patrol is run by Glenn Spencer. Thank you for sending him to us. This man is, in my opinion, the most dangerous of them all because, for one reason, he is a culture warrior. He sees things from the Michael Savage point of view of language, race, borders, culture, this sort of stuff, and it's all tied up in some form of Americanism. His playground is large, diffuse, and virtually non-geographical. He annually raises over $400,000 for his work. These elements increase his long-term financial viability. His hate-mongering strategy for social change is the least likely of them all to be prosecuted. I know a lot of these people, the crazy rancher Roger Barnett, Chris Simcox, Glenn Spencer, as well as a number of other restrictionist activists. In my opinion, Ranch Rescue is the most apt to cause bodily harm to migrants. On the other hand, Spencer is, in my opinion, the most to be watched because he can project his project into virtual or hyper-reality. By doing that, he can mobilize folks to increase participation of those who would express his sentiments even if they are located thousands of miles away. Through his website, he may actually be leading people to some of the other groups that are mentioned and some that were not. Rusty Childress and other supporters of the Protect Arizona Now initiative, including some of the members of our state legislature, probably belong in the same club with Spencer, and we have to cast our net farther. Back to the elements of racism, bigotry, resentment, and indifference, all of which are very destructive within the body politic. It must be noted that no one is happy with the inexorable south to north migration except some employers in some sectors of our economy. Landowners have properties trashed. Federal, state, tribal land managers are outraged at the impact of the migration on managed lands. Local law enforcement is ill-equipped or trained. As a sidebar, some of you may have seen where Alabama state troopers have just finished training on how to enforce national immigration laws. There's not a lot of difference between that and vigilantism from a human rights perspective. Elected officials are not happy with cost or enraged voters in their respective jurisdictions. Healthcare providers are forced to absorb inordinate cost. Environmentalists are not happy. Taxpayers, civil, human rights folks, nobody's happy. Faith communities are certainly not happy. Then there's the perceived, if not real, economic issues. My colleagues, political scientists who disaggregated California Prop 187 voting behavior a few years ago found economic issues to explain more than 50% of the variance in that vote. That is very significant. We cannot fight vigilantism without addressing at least some of the underlying sources of discontent in our body politic. Critical school thinking has long told us that if legal political order is not accomplished and sustained, alternative forms of power will prevail. And in our case, the legal political folks cannot point in just one direction to responsible parties. It's not just a bunch of right-wingers. Contrary to the conventional liberal-conservative split, I assure you that vigilante power expression can come from either side. Studies have shown that folks who hold memberships in groups against population growth or radical environmental groups are also likely to hold memberships in restrictionist immigration groups. Currently, federal administrators are bent on redefining all border issues in terms of security. Many pundits are doing the same. That's not unlike vigilantism. Arizona's Senator John Kyle recently said of those whom we are loosely calling vigilantes today that he fully understands their frustrations. Translation, he supports them. Certainly, we can all call for the state of Arizona to step in. We need legal political power for significant change and to send an appropriate message. Unfortunately, Arizona investigates abuse claims about as often as Utah investigates polygamy. What is left for those of us who work in transformative faith traditions, in particular in civil society in general, is to fully engage the moral cultural model. Both the legal political and the moral cultural models require substantive discourse around level tables for which the participants are fully and adequately prepared. Few are willing to spend that kind of time. The ill-defined political culture of Arizona, that's my own dig at my own state, and the comparatively small influence of mainline denominations and the peace Protestants makes this a very difficult challenge. The immediate burden then falls on the very much less politically active Hispanic voters and activists and upon the Roman Catholic Church's slowly increasing voice in these matters. Law can do some things in some individual cases, but the discourse that is required for the larger picture is about alterity. We're talking about others and otherness. Racism, bigotry, resentment, and indifference have all got to be addressed. Just as, quote, we the people can make laws, we also hold those four cultural elements too near and dear, and we even institutionalize them. The subject of this panel is, in the last analysis, not just about them, it's also about us. The strongest corollary to vigilantism is indifference.
Thanks so much, Dr. Cornelius and the staff of the New Center for inviting me here to speak with you all today. My mother, Magdalena Cruz, was born and raised in southeastern Arizona. Globe, Miami, and Thatcher Safford are small hamlets that developed around the vibrant mining industries that once thrived throughout the region. When I was a child, my mother regaled me with stories of the Arizona desert. One story in particular still resonates with me today. That is the story about las luces fantasmas, or the ghost lights that used to scare my mother when she was a little girl. These ghost lights would appear only at night, in the distance, and hover just off of the desert floor. They seemed to move under their own power, and they changed colors as they flickered incandescently. My grandmother Petra used to warn her children not to venture out at night because the evil spirits, las luces fantasmas, were waiting to abduct them. My grandmother's admonition may have been more prophetic than she realized, because evil spirits have emerged from the desert recently, and these specters have taken the form of vigilante ranchers who protect their property using highly controversial tactics. Armed with military fatigues, binoculars, hunting dogs, sniper towers, high-powered firearms, and fake police badges, these ranchers have surreptitiously abducted, detained, and assaulted undocumented persons who are in transit across their ranch holdings. Rather than merely protecting property rights, these actions belie a darker subtext: the normalizing of aggression and violence against undocumented persons who have entered the United States. As Isabel mentioned earlier, rancher violations against the undocumented have included armed interdictions, physical assaults, assaults with animals, false imprisonments, and the piracy of vehicles, all done through the prism of an active and ongoing interstate conspiracies. Rancher defenses are largely grounded in private property rights, but property rights have never been absolute. There are powerful limitations on property rights. For example, one cannot run a meth lab on your property and claim private property rights to avoid prosecution. An individual can't serial kill other individuals on your property and claim private property rights to avoid prosecution. One cannot molest a child on their private property and claim private property rights to avoid prosecution. And ranchers cannot set traps or conduct activities in such a way so as to subject others to foreseeable or unreasonable risks on their properties. Ranchers justify their actions along two corridors: trespass and self-defense. Ranchers claim that these individuals are trespassing on their private property, which gives them the right to abduct them. Traditionally, trespass has been grounded in two concerns: adverse possession, which is essentially squatters' rights, and the physical appropriation of land. But those two issues in particular don't apply in this set of circumstances, because migrant sojourners are traversing across the land rather than entering the land expressly for the purposes of appropriating it. Self-defense. Ranchers are only protecting themselves, they claim, against migrants. But this too seems unlikely, because most undocumented migrants are poor and unarmed, while most of the vigilante ranchers are well armed, in groups, and are actively attempting to confront migrant crossers by tracking them with hunting dogs and night sight devices. Till just recently, law enforcement has not taken a great deal of interest in investigating the activities of these ranchers. But there is room to challenge these actions lawfully in the private realm through the use of damage litigation, meaning suing individuals privately. Damage litigation would discourage these ranchers from their offensive activities, as well as provide compensation to genuine victims. Responding to such vigilante activity through public interest damage litigation. Ideally, successful strategies in public interest oriented litigation turns on winning symbolic as well as pragmatic victories. The nature of the legal actions chosen by public interest lawyers should say something about the types of wrongs being contested. In this set of circumstances, the choice of legal claims would be meant to underscore the predatory dimensions of these ranch networks. First, because these ranch networks act in ways similar to organized crime networks, they should be treated as such. Thus, 18 United States Code 1962, the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, or RICO, is an appropriate claim to bring against the frontier gangsters that operate these ranch networks. Second, because the clandestine conspiracies hatched by these ranch networks are grounded clearly in racial and xenophobic animus, the brutalities committed by these networks should be actionable under federal anti-conspiracy statutes. 42 United States Code 1985, subsection 3, originally created just after the Civil War to suppress organized KKK violence. Third, because migrant victims suffer from personal injuries as a direct result of rancher violence, migrant victims should be able to make claims against ranchers using state tort or civil racketeering laws. Aptly named, damage litigation is a valuable tool because it can financially obliterate defendants by saturating their personal assets to cover successful damage awards. The types of holdings that a damage award can get at are all real property, meaning all land, all personal property, boats, cars, bank accounts, savings, investments, wages can be attached. Insurance policies can be pierced. And certainly devises under wills and trusts can be had as well. Damage litigation in the public interest is meant to raise defendants financially, which is, of course, a fitting fate for social predators that delight in the hunting of other human beings for sport. Perhaps it is in the artful use of federal and state claims through public interest-oriented damage litigation that civil rights lawyers can finally exorcise the evil spirits that continue to haunt the parched deserts of Tombstone. Thank you.